welcome. Today, as President Obama explains his Mideast military strategy to the nation, we meet a scholar who can help us understand the enemy whose name we are just learning, ISIL. We will meet Reza Aslan in just a moment. Also on today's program, journalism, past and future. Newly unearthed pages of the Brooklyn Digest magazine give insight into 1940s Kings County culture. Then we consider virtual reality journalism, where you can look around inside the story. What's the message of that medium? Plus, in our public intellectual segment, where we examine new research with the power to change our minds and public policy, the deep structural injuries to the economy from potential climate change. First, though, the militant force that has been called too extreme even for al-Qaeda, ISIL, which is short for Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. ISIL has declared a growing caliphate, an official Islamic state, from outside Baghdad, Iraq, to Aleppo in Syria. The U.S. has been attacking ISIL, as you probably know, and ISIL's allies from the air. We're told it's important to do so. But who are they, and what's Islam got to do with it? Joining us, a scholar of religion and history across the Middle East, Reza Aslan. He's written about jihad and religious violence in his 2009 book, Beyond Fundamentalism, Confronting Religious Extremism in the Age of Globalization. His latest volume is Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, just out in paperback. And we'll get to that too. Reza Aslan, welcome.
That's good to see you, Ryan.
Have you ever seen anything like ISIS or ISIL or Islamic State before? Does this recall something you know from history? Everybody who are, just contemporary political analysts are saying this is unprecedented.
The closest parallel is a movement called the Kharijites, which is, 14 centuries old. And that's actually not a bad parallel, because what ISIS or ISIL has been doing is really trying to return to some kind of purified, unadulterated, and frankly, purely imaginary, perfected Islam of the past. These are ultra-Puritans, and like Puritans of any religion, they want to roll back what they see as innovations or corruptions within their particular religious community, which is why, by the way, that the overwhelming majority of ISIS's victims have been Shia. The Shia are seen by these kinds of Sunni puritanical fanatics as being the most heretical of all Islamic sects, because they followed, different leaders, different traditions. And so in a sense, going back 14 centuries, that's about as close as you can get to what we're seeing right now.
That's crazy. Also, in terms of the type of Islam that they want to return to, this extremely fundamental, even more fundamentalist. I know people don't like that word, but even more fundamentalist than the Taliban, as we learned they were governing in Afghanistan.
Yes, and that notion of returning to this kind of extreme, purified version of Islam, there is an actual term for it. It's called Wahhabism. It's a Saudi invention. It's only about 150 years old or so. The larger movement is called Salafism. It's really an attempt to create an ultra-orthodoxy, if you will, within Islam. The problem with Islam, as you and I have talked about on different occasions, is that you're talking about the second largest religion in the world, soon to be the first largest religion, but it's a religion without any kind of center, without any sort of authority. There's no Muslim Pope, there's no Muslim Vatican, there is no single authority figure who can say what is and what is not proper Islamic behavior, proper Islamic beliefs.
And the Quran, as the central holy book, doesn't give a guidance in a form that is sort of universally interpreted, at least in the basics?
Absolutely not. I mean, the Quran, like any scripture, can be interpreted however you want it to be. Part of that has to do with scripture itself. I mean, for a text to remain relevant for thousands of years, it has to be infinitely malleable. You have to be able to turn it into whatever you want it to. And so that's why, whether you're talking about the Torah or whether you're talking about the New Testament or whether about the Quran, you see so many often competing and even contradictory interpretations of the same text. And so you usually have some kind of centralized religious authority to define what is the proper interpretation and what is not, but that simply does not exist in Islam.
So how does this extreme conservative or orthodox religion intersect with the political chaos in Syria and the weak government in Iraq? Is it just that this radicalism is always sitting there, and then when there's a weak enough state, it can start to flex its muscle and thrive? Or does it have more to do with particular politics, and they really also have grievances against Syria, or really have grievances against the United States and the West?
Well, first of all, this group ISIS has a backstory. They have a history. They're really formed from what used to be called AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This was Zarqawi's group. By the way, Zarqawi, remember, was thrown out of Al-Qaeda. He was sort of divorced from Al-Qaeda because of the extreme violence that he perpetrated in Iraq, violence that even, as you said before, for Al-Qaeda was going a step too far. And of course, Zarqawi was eventually killed, and now what we see in ISIS is the kind of latest iteration of that movement. But the ideology behind ISIS, what is referred to as jihadism, is itself quite a new phenomenon. Jihadism, understand, is a transnational phenomenon. This can get a little bit weird and tricky because ISIS now refers to itself as the Islamic State, and so you think to yourself that this is a state group, it's a nationalist group, but it's not. It's an anti-nationalist group. Jihadists believe that the very concept of the nation state is anathema. It's a sinful thing, that the only organization that can exist is the Ummah, the worldwide body of faith. Their ultimate goal is to destroy all borders, all boundaries, to reconstitute the globe as a single world order under their control. And now, while that seems absurd and ridiculous, after all, they are only about 2,000 military fighters or so when you're talking about ISIS. So let's not get too, let's not exaggerate too much. But nevertheless, they have managed to, at the very least rhetorically, do something that no other jihadist group has ever tried to do, and that is declare the caliphate.
Right, because they control some land, some actual territory in northern Iraq.
That's right.
And nearby Syria.
That's right. And this dream of the caliphate, of course, the caliphate was disbanded in 1924 by Kemal Ataturk, but even long before that, really, right until about the beginning of the 8th century, really since the 8th century, there has been no such thing as a politically significant unified caliphate. The Muslim community is dispersed all over the world. It comes in different shapes and sizes and flavors and sects, as you can imagine, for such a large religion. But all Muslims have in their core this dream of reunifying the Ummah, of recreating the caliphate. People talk about it all the time in peaceful terms and in violent terms. Al-Qaeda wanted to recreate the caliphate, but
yes,
they never dared to do so. And so simply by naming the caliph, simply by saying we've recreated the caliphate, this is an organization that has sort of created an enormous kind of image for itself. Even among Muslims who would never subscribe to their violence or their ideology, it's such a bold statement that it's a demand to be taken seriously ideologically.
Does the Quran give them a religious text underpinning for the violence?
It does, insofar as if you are a person looking for justification for violence, you can find it in the Quran, you can find it in the New Testament, you can find it in the Hebrew Bible, you can find it in the Bhagavad Gita, you can find it in the Mahabharata, you can find it in every scripture in the world. Now, if you are a peaceful, pluralistic person, you could look at the exact same scripture and find justifications for peace and justice. The same Quran that says, slay the idolater where you find him, also says, if you kill one individual, it is as though you have killed all of humanity. It's the person who brings these ideas to the scripture. It's not the scripture that provides these ideas.
That's almost to say that all of scripture across all religions is meaningless, because it will all get interpreted by the individual in terms of the current political context and their interests.
Not meaningless, but utterly neutral. Scripture without interpretation is just words on a page. It requires someone to confront it and to interpret it for it to have any kind of meaning whatsoever.
But then what about the subject of your current book, Jesus, who your title calls a zealot? He was a zealot for justice. And the New Testament makes that very clear, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Jesus was an insurrectionist. Now, by the way, zealot had a very specific meaning in Jesus' time. There were many, many Jews who would have proudly referred to themselves as zealots, because in Jesus' time, zealot specifically meant someone who is utterly committed to the sole sovereignty of God. And indeed, after Jesus' death, there was an entire party of Jews that arose called the Zealot Party. But insofar as a man who represents the power that religious faith has to transform a society, to demand justice, to confront political and religious powers, Jesus is a perfect example of that. And you know, that's an idea that's been around long before Jesus and has been around since Jesus.
If the New Testament says that people will be judged based on how they treat the poorest among us, in effect, maybe it backs up your theory that Scripture is neutral, that there is now a prosperity gospel that has developed in our generation where they use Christianity to argue that, hey, it's time to go and get rich, everybody.
Jesus wants you to be rich, that's right. Or as I refer to it, Jesus wants you to drive a Bentley. The prosperity gospel, which, by the way, is the fastest growing Protestant movement in the United States.
Still? It didn't have a heyday 5-10 years ago?
I mean, look at Joel Osteen, look at T.D. Jakes. These guys are still making money hand over fist through what is essentially an attempt to turn the Gospels into a pyramid scheme. But that gives you a perfect example of this, is if you can take a man like Jesus, whose entire ministry was predicated on protection of the poor, and condemning the wealthy, and turn that ministry into a call for accumulation of wealth, that should give you an idea of how neutral Scripture is until someone confronts it. That Scripture is an infinitely malleable thing. Why do we read words that were written 5,000 years ago? It's not because they're true, it's because they still matter. And the reason they matter is because they can be interpreted however one needs to interpret them. The history of religions is littered with dead scriptures, not because they were not true, but because they were not malleable enough to keep going.
We're almost out of time. To bring it back to ISIL, is there a demographic? Is there a type of person based on poverty or tribal connections, whatever the right term is, that makes them most susceptible to or interested in joining something like ISIL?
I wrote about this a lot in Beyond Fundamentalism. ISIL is a very sophisticated, modern, and even globalized organization. If you think about it, this notion that the world shouldn't have borders and boundaries, that ethnicity and nationality are irrelevant, these are very modern conceptions. And so it's not that people who are poor or dispossessed join ISIS. On the contrary, it's the more educated, the more middle class who join these kinds of ideologies who are predicated on global reformation. Poor people don't care about the globe. They care about their own communities.
But is that the opposite of in the West or in the United States, where we presume that education makes people more moderate?
Exactly. And it's not the case. That is certainly not the case. Now, of course, if you're looking at a nationalist organization like Hamas or Hezbollah, they tend to draw poorer people because they're addressing very immediate needs. When you're talking about Al-Qaeda or ISIS, you're talking about transnational organizations that really have no concern really with immediate needs. Their concern is global transformation. And you have to have a certain level of education, a certain level of knowledge, and even economic advancement to think that way.
Right. You have to have a certain, that's fascinating. I never thought of it that way before. You have to have a certain amount of comfort to think in those abstract terms.
Precisely.
And develop those abstract goals. So
Precisely.
Does bombing ISIS leadership to try to eliminate, in the way President Obama has been describing them, eliminate the leadership by killing them, create more or fewer ISIS members 5 years from now?
The problem with a jihadist organization like ISIS is that they are fighting a war of the imagination. This is a cosmic conflict for ISIS. They're not interested in land. Those things are transitory. They're interested in defeating evil. As far as they're concerned, they're fighting a war that is actually taking place in heaven, not on earth, between the forces of good and evil, darkness and light. When that is what is at stake, there is no negotiation, there is no conversation. You can have a conversation with Hamas, you can have a conversation with Hezbollah, because what they want is concrete. It may be unachievable, but it's concrete. ISIS wants nothing that is measurable or concrete. They want the world. And so the only response to an ISIS militant is a military response. Now, what is important, however, is that ISIS uses these very common grievances to draw people to their cause. And those grievances, despite the fact that ISIS couldn't really care less about them, are legitimate grievances. And we have to not just kill ISIS fighters, we have to take away their appeal by addressing those grievances.
Enlightening if scary, scary if enlightening. Reza Aslan, thank you.
My pleasure.
In the news business, it's said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Newsreels, television, and the internet have squared that number, bringing us events in motion. What's next? A third dimension, immersive 3D journalism, which places the viewer inside the scene. The technology already exists. In fact, Facebook recently spent $2 billion to acquire a virtual reality headset manufacturer. How exactly does this work, and how much of a game changer might it be? If, as Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message, what's the message inherent in a 3D medium? Nonny de la Pena has some thoughts and has brought some powerful examples. A former print journalist and a documentary filmmaker, she's a pioneer in the new field of immersive journalism. She joins us via Skype from Los Angeles. Welcome and hello from New York.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And I want to play for our viewers an example of your work right away. I want to warn everybody that some of this will be quite disturbing for the violence that it depicts or implies. But Nonny, do you want to set this up for us?
Yeah, well, first off, I want to note that what you're looking at is not gratuitous violence. It's not just something I've made up, but rather these are taken, all of the work I've been doing as a journalist is I take real scenes and I make them available in this 3D virtual environment. And so what you're going to look at is actually a recreation of something that really happened. And the idea is that we're trying to tell important stories and use medium that is reaching new audiences to help them understand what's going on in the world.
So the viewer seeing this using your technology would be wearing a headset of some kind and immersive journalism, immersed in that sense?
Yes, they wear virtual reality goggles that track wherever they look. And what happens is that using really good tracking and good audio and really good recreations is the mind gets tricked. You actually feel like you're present on scene in another place. And it's an extraordinary feeling. I mean, people know they're here, but they feel like they're there too. And that allows the audience to become a witness, feeling like they're standing on the street when an event unfolds. And it really does help people get a deeper understanding of what's going on.
So here's an example about the Syrian children refugee crisis. Take a look.
A third of all Syrians have been displaced by the war. Reports indicate children have been specifically targeted in the violence. There are now over 1 million refugee children. Food supplies are severely strained, and the number of refugees has been growing exponentially.
Well, that was so disturbing. That was so powerful. But Nonny, give us more of the context. It seems like a one-on-one way to communicate. If an individual has to be wearing that headset to have that immersive experience that replicates the world of Syrian refugee children. Are you going to have millions of Americans wearing these headsets, and that's how, you know, the news from Syria is going to have more of an impact, or what's your ultimate vision?
Yeah, I think that we are seeing goggles hitting the market like crazy. You have the Oculus Rift, which Palmer Luckey, who founded that company, was a lab assistant here at USC prior to starting that company. And now with Facebook buying it, Oculus Rift for $2 billion, we know that Facebook is betting that millions of people are going to be wearing these goggles, and I am too. I think that it's such a visceral way to get your news story, much in the way that, you know, would everybody own a radio, or is everyone going to have a television set in their home? I think that having virtual reality equipment is going to become commonplace in the future.
Huh. So people are going to use it to get news or documentary type experiences like this, and also what? For entertainment, for music, for TV series, for porn and gambling? I don't know.
Well, you know, we do know the porn industry drove the internet in the beginning, so I wouldn't be surprised if we saw it in virtual reality as well. But that's really kind of beside the point. For me, the main thing is that audiences aren't necessarily picking up newspapers anymore. And we do want informed citizenry. We do want people to know what's happening in their world in order to make decisions, from voting to you know, whatever charities they want to give to. They need to understand what's really happening, and it's important for our future as Americans, let alone as global citizens. So that being said, having these very visceral experiences, and I have to tell you that original footage you saw there of the bomb going off, that's from a real scene. You know, all those buildings are recreated exactly as they were on the street corner of Aleppo. And in the second half, I had a team at a border camp on the edge of Syria recording all those children, the millions of, literally tens of thousands of kids overwhelming these camps.
And let's give our viewers a little bit of an insight into how that is done, what you were just describing. So viewers, to highlight Nonny's material in the pieces, let's look at this clip from the 2014 Future of Storytelling Conference that featured some of her work. This is a very short clip. This is about 20 seconds. But again, this might be traumatic for some of you because of the content, but you'll see how what we saw earlier was based on this.
يا شعب بيدوم سآمن حنن الحرية
Do you want to say anything more to tie the first piece and the second piece together?
Yeah, so you can see that we actually used real footage to inform everything we were building. But not only did we have to use this original clip of the girl singing, we also had to source all the footage in the aftermath, which meant we had to find cell phone video from multiple people. And then we utilized that information to inform how we constructed the pieces. So these pieces are based on real stories, real events, and are constructed to accurately depict what happened in the real world, but allow an audience to be there on scene along with the journalists who recorded the material, or the other witnesses who happen to be present on scene.
I mean, if we can watch television with a certain emotional distance and think, oh, this horrible thing that's going on in Bangladesh or in Somalia or wherever is horrible, but it doesn't move us to action in some way, that it would just be unescapable once this technology becomes common, if it does?
I have to tell you that when I brought this to Project Syria to the World Economic Forum, I was amazed by the amount of individuals who told me afterwards they'd set up direct deductions for children Syrian, you know, for children refugees, Syrian children refugees, or have brought it. I've had that piece travel around the world to work as a way to raise money for refugee camps. So I would say that these pieces seem to get people to take action in a way that I haven't seen some of my more traditional documentary work do.
Let's take a look at something that I gather you're working on now called Use of Force. This is a little different, right?
It's a whole nother piece, but with similar types of construct. This piece tells the story of two witnesses who caught on very grainy cell phone video an event where a man who had been living in the U.S. for 27 years was deported, tried to sneak back into his wife and 5 kids, and was beaten and tased to death by the Border Patrol. They had claimed he resisted arrest, but these tapes showed otherwise. And it stayed very under the radar. And then we got a hold of the footage through a producer named John Carlos Frey, who was able to publicize this case and put it up on PBS. And what we try to do with that is, again, let you be a witness, let you be on scene. And we actually took one of the witnesses and we scanned her and we modeled her to be herself, and then we motion captured her so that she would actually appear as herself on scene, reenacting her own actions instead of, me as a documentary filmmaker reporter saying, and then what did you remember? Now we actually see her do it herself and show us what happened that night through her own memory, through her body as much as her words. But Use of Force is another piece along these lines, and it will be it premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival, was funded by Tribeca and Google and AP, and it will be at Indiecade, which is the Independent Games Festival in Culver City in early October.
And so let's watch this sample.
Hey, he's not resisting, guys. Why you guys keep pressing on him? He's not even resisting. He's not even resisting. He's not resisting. He's not resisting. He's not resisting. Stop! Why aren't they doing anything? He's not resisting. He's not resisting. Oh my God.
Now, I'm guessing this was made before Ferguson or Eric Garner?
Yeah, it was made before. Absolutely. I mean, obviously, these are some issues that we've seen come up with Ferguson and other really tragic cases. Yet, by making you stand there, it's kind of amazing, that bridge scene. I have people in my room. I mean, there's no bridge there. There's no, they're standing on a flat ground, and you can actually see in the periphery. So you know that you're in some room somewhere, and yet people are leaning over as far as they can to try to see over the edge of that bridge. It's kind of amazing how much it transports your whole body and your whole sense of being there.
But do I understand that unlike the Syria footage, that's fiction, that's made up?
Oh, no, that's real.
Oh, it is?
Oh, absolutely. That's from a real scene. All that audio you're hearing really happened. They killed that man.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Where?
Yeah. This was on the border of, just right on the edge of Tijuana border in San Diego. and just on the U.S. side. What had happened was a Border Patrol officer had roughed up this guy, and he complained to the supervisor, and the supervisor, instead of doing anything, sent him, the victim, out into a pen with the same guy who'd done the original violence, and then they beat him and tased him to death. They killed him.
So are news organizations or other media organizations expressing an interest in your work, or is that beside the point? Because if the technology really does become widespread, then everything will have to feed it.
Well, I think that it's going to be a little while before we aren't going to need certain resources towards us, and I think journalism, the best practice in journalism. I think it's important for journalistic institutions to try to work with this and start establishing the best practices for using this medium. It's extremely powerful. It really does make people cry and get very emotional. And I think that we have to be careful that we use it in a way that isn't manipulative. I have been contacted by journalistic organizations. People are becoming very interested in utilizing this as a future way of news reporting and informing the public in immersive journalism, which is what I call it.
Fascinating. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much.
Up next, Brooklyn in 1946, from the parched pages of the Brooklyn Digest. Novelist Imogen Binney wrote, "Oh, Williamsburg, there was a point when you seemed like a scary, tough neighborhood, but now it's obvious that the graffiti on your walls gets put there by art students. Yes, Brooklyn changes so fast, it's hard to recall what some blocks were like last week, much less last century. But today, we can offer a rare glimpse of Brooklyn past, the year 1946. An archivist at the Brooklyn Library School Outreach Initiative, Brooklyn Connections, has dug up old issues of a magazine few of us have ever even heard of, Brooklyn Digest magazine. The archivist and educator is Brendan Murphy. He posted about the digest in the blog Brooklynology. He joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me.
We're going to see some images from 1946. Just briefly set up what this is.
Sure thing. So the Brooklyn Digest magazine is a small monthly-ish, about once every 2 months or so. And we have 4 copies of it in the archive at the Brooklyn Collection. We have July, September, November, and then early January, February of 47. Basically, it's kind of like a little Mad magazine from that time, full of comics and short stories. A magazine that was titled Brooklyn Digest Magazine, the different digest for Brooklyn, about Brooklyn, in Brooklyn.
So let's see what the Brooklyn Digest looked like in 1946, 1947. Let's put up our first image.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see the cover, the Brooklyn Beat. You have your features. You have Barbara Stanwyck and Walt Whitman, Girls Town, a quiz box, and all of them really had this kind of cartoonish air to them, with a comic on the front as well. 15 cents, or you could pay $1.50 for the whole year.
Walt Whitman, who lived a century before. But this, I think, has a different title than the other ones we're going to see. The Brooklyn Digest magazine is what we'll see on the other ones. This says just Brooklyn, and then the subhead is the different digest.
Yeah, on the title page, usually they have said Brooklyn Digest magazine, but I think, and that's just really telling of the fact that it was a small publication published out of the Ridgewood Times building, which kind of borders the Brooklyn and Queens, by young kids. So I think they were really feeling it out and quite possibly figuring out what worked best.
I'm curious what some of these things were, if you know. We know who Walt Whitman was, Barbara Stanwyck, but how about Girls Town? People have heard of Boys Town.
Yeah. Girls Town was actually an article about it was a home for older women. It was like a retirement community for moms, basically. And it was just this little article that was profiling one that was in Brooklyn. And a lot of them were just kind of basically little community human interest stories.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's see another slide. And here we have Brooklyn Digest, 1946, 1947. Now, what is this? This looks like May 1946, all the way in the upper left, right?
Yeah, it looks like November, I believe it is.
Oh, November. Oh, NOV, there it is.
Yeah. So similar, you have kind of your basic features that you're going to find in every one of the magazines. You have your, Jean Tierney was the starlet at the time. There's a great article about her in there with images. You have war in Brooklyn.
Frankifying her.
Yeah.
Jean Tierney.
Yeah. You have war in Brooklyn, which, considering this is just after the end of World War II, that's actually referencing the Battle of Brooklyn. So we're going all the way back.
Huh.
And the Fox Amateur Hour, the Brooklyn Quiz Box, again, the Great Scott, they had a radio host, actually, who would write in and do some of these kind of little comic anecdotes for them. And then again, you've got cartoons that went throughout.
That wasn't the great Scott Muni. He came a little later, right?
Yes, he did.
New York radio host. But that first reference, football Dodgers. Now, it was in that coming baseball season, 1947, that Jackie Robinson
Absolutely, yeah.
started playing professional ball in Brooklyn.
Yeah, sure did, yeah. He played professional ball, and that was the year, of course, that he broke the color barrier. They do a lot of Dodger profiles in this magazine of Dodger players.
The actual baseball Dodgers. Did you see any Jackie Robinson references in the issues you were
Not
able
at
to
all,
surface?
actually. I didn't find any of them, no.
And were there actual football Dodgers? Like there was the baseball and New York football Giants both at that time.
That was in reference to the Dodgers manager and his shoe collection.
Okay. What has, let's go on to one more cover right away for the fun of it, and then we'll talk a little more behind the scenes.
Yeah, I love this
January,
one.
February 47. This is the next issue.
Mickey Rooney, who knew? He was totally dashing. But I think this issue's great. It is, again, 47, January, February. It's the last of the 4 that we have. So this is as far as it goes up, as far as I know. I don't know exactly when it ended. There's not a lot of information out there about it. So you have your normal, you have your feature. They talk about the Gershwins in here. That was the Brooklyn history aspect of this particular.
Were they from Brooklyn?
Mm-hmm. Sure were.
And still alive and writing at that time.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
Fascinating. Were there ads?
There were ads, actually. So there were ads in the back of the magazine. Toward the back, there was about 3 pages, and they were restaurant ads as well for places to eat. There were ads for clothing, just very small, a lot of them local, actually, to the Ridgewood area.
And was it clear who the target audience was? I mean, Brooklyn, of course, then as now, demographically so diverse. There were rich people in Brooklyn, there were poor people in Brooklyn, there were middle-class people in Brooklyn.
Yeah. The target audience, my best guess would be kind of the younger generation. I found obituaries actually for the 2 editors of the magazine.
Huh.
And from that, and my limited math skills, was able to find out when they were born, and they were 26 and 24 when they were making this magazine in 1946. So I imagine their target was their age group. A lot of the comics are silly, and I also feel like you're not going to find those on the desk of people from Brooklyn Heights at this time.
And some of them were suggestive. Let's take a look at one of these cartoon images that I think we have lined up to come up. Now, if people can't see all the language at the bottom of this, of course, we see what position the woman is in, and it says, Daisy, she gets around without a bicycle.
Yeah, it sure does. Yeah.
That was a little before the Prospect Park bike lane, right?
A little bit before, yeah.
Prospect Park West.
We weren't having debates about the bike lane at that time. Each of the magazines had a little pin-up, for lack of a better word. All the little characters around the outside are saying kind of little comments or double entendres, as it were. One of them says, shady lady. The other one, what a surface, S-U-R-F. So each one of them had a zoot suitor from Brooklyn, who was often a man with the zoot suit hanging next to him, actually. And I think it's really fun. It also really illustrates the demographic of the magazine, quite possibly.
So the pinup was a cartoon.
Yeah, always a cartoon, yes.
All right, let's look at another one. This is a different cartoon from, you tell me whether this is from the same issue or from a different issue. Oh my goodness, Gowanus Canal. So polluted then as now?
Polluted then as now, absolutely. The Brooklyn collection has great images of waste essentially being dumped into Newtown Creek and the Gowanus Canal. Its reputation precedes it. This is great though, a merman sitting on a car, and
a merman, and again, just to get everybody focused, if you're just half paying attention, this is not what you might think at first, a mermaid, unless this maid has hair on her chest and is smoking a cigar and wearing a man's hat. Not that those things are impossible by any means, but this is you're calling this a merman.
Yes, yes I am. And I'm making that distinction. With that said, there's no caption. This is actually in a different issue, an issue that had a little travel guide. They wrote a travel guide to Brooklyn and what you should see, what you're going to hear when you're there. They said there were 2 languages spoken in Brooklyn, English and double talk. They talked about the geography, saying that Brooklyn is this place. There's a river called the East River, and then somewhere else is New York City, basically.
But that cartoon had the car kind of emerging from the water in the canal and the merman. So I'm thinking that this is, you know, the 1946 or 7 equivalent of, and there it is. I see. There it is in context.
Yeah,
the cartoon
absolutely.
is in the upper right.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, you know, The Simpsons. 2-headed fish coming out of the polluted water by the nuclear power plant?
For sure, absolutely. This is our equivalent, I suppose, a little bit earlier on. Yeah.
From the polluted Gowanus. What kind of monster is going to emerge from these waters?
And we still don't know what's going to emerge from the Gowanus Canal. I think the jury's still out on that one.
Gentrification, mostly.
Quite possibly, and a dolphin occasionally, yeah.
So what else is on these? But wherein our natives undergo Baedeker touch, huh?
Yeah. So Baedeker was the father of the travel guide, essentially. And you see on there the geography, the topography, the geology. They talk about the food, which is basically beer and hot dogs. They talk about the literature and what you're going to find there. And they say you're going to find the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. And they also say you're going to find the Brooklyn Digest magazine.
There's still a Brooklyn Eagle.
There's still a Brooklyn Eagle, for sure. It's not the same Brooklyn Daily Eagle that we had 100 years, essentially, and the Brooklyn collection has the privilege of having the entire archive of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle.
So going through all this fun, what's the biggest thing that you think you learn about Brooklyn then as compared to Brooklyn now?
Yeah. So I work with an education initiative called the Brooklyn Connections Program. We teach kids how to do research, basically. We're an outreach education program. And the biggest thing we always try to tell them is always look a little bit deeper, because the story that you find on the outside is probably not as interesting as the story that you find just one page, the second O of the Google. And I think the thing that's most entertaining is really seeing neighborhoods, and neighborhoods that existed, neighborhoods with neighborhood pride. And that's something that we absolutely still have today, but it seems like at this time, Brooklyn, it was a more small town feel. Every neighborhood had a main street, in a way. And you see that really represented in the photos that we have in the collection, in the community gatherings that we have photos of in the collection as well. And I think it's something that a lot of people, if they're missing, would like back.
We saw a little of it for our TV viewers. Where else can people see more?
Absolutely. So Brooklynology is the blog. It's the blog of the Brooklyn collection. We don't just do small magazines. We have tons of really random, amazing things inside the collection. Postcards, photos, objects and such. They're welcome to come to the Brooklyn collection during our open hours, and they can peruse on their own.
Brooklynology.org.
There you go.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Time for Public Intellectual, where we examine new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. Lately, even climate change doubters are beginning to see that the future financial costs of global warming are likely to be huge. But to date, most research into the issue resembles a checklist. Reduced crop production, check. Increased energy consumption, check. Property loss, check. But what sort of impact could climate change have on economic growth itself? Is there perhaps a positive effect, a kind of creative destruction after a Sandy or Katrina when we spend money to rebuild? Or do some economic wounds never heal? Joining us via Skype from Columbia University is Amir Jinnah. He and his colleague Solomon Shang have just published the paper, The Causal Effect of Environmental Catastrophe on Long-Run Economic Growth. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thanks for having me.
And we're going to put up a slide that shows some of your work. And I guess this first slide is really the 4 possible effects you considered before you researched the impact, really 4 competing hypotheses. Can you walk us through this?
So these were the 4 hypotheses that we would see very often in the literature, saying what might happen after disasters, but no one had really proven one of them conclusively. So the 4 from top to bottom in the figure that you see was this idea of creative destruction, that when a disaster hits, it might stimulate the economy because there's so much inflow of aid. Next, countries could build back better. So initially there would be some losses, but because of increased wages as people need to reconstruct and because of improving old capital, the economy would actually do better than it was doing before the disaster hit. Alternatively, some people thought there would be a recovery to a trend where the previous disaster, the trend previous to the disaster would be the one which the country could converge back to. And then finally, the idea that there would be no recovery and that a disaster could knock a country off its growth path and send it off in a decline or in some different direction.
Now, keeping the slide up here for a minute, you studied more than 6,000 severe weather events, cyclones, typhoons, and hurricanes. Did one of these four models turn out to reflect reality, or was it a combination?
So the one that turned out to reflect reality the best was the hypothesis of no recovery. So we found no creative destruction like people had been saying previously in some policy dialogues.
Why not?
Well, there's many reasons why it might not actually happen. What we think is happening here is that essentially when capital is lost, it diverts investment into rebuilding that would have otherwise gone towards a productive investment. So even if you do build back new and better capital, something which might, you would think, give a bump to the economy, really the losses which you experience year after year in some cases might be doing more damage than it could be good as they get rebuilt.
And we've got your second slide up, a graph which shows this trend. Can you interpret this for the viewers?
So the black line is the effect that we find on the economic growth. So the horizontal gray line labeled baseline trend would be what's happening, what you would expect to happen in the country before the disaster hits. And the black line is what we observe happening afterwards. So we see that on the x-axis for up to 15 to 20 years afterwards, there's actually a decline in economic growth.
Is a threshold normally reached after a period of time, say 20 years, where recovery actually takes place?
We are using 20 years because I think it's the maximum we were able to do given the sample that we have. So we have hurricanes, typhoons, tropical cyclones from 1950 to 2008. And then we have economic growth indicators from 1970. And it was the only way we weren't able to start cutting away our sample. And then it just would have made the statistics too difficult to interpret. So it's longer than people have looked at for any kind of shock before to an economy. It's a very long-term effect, and it's also the longest we can go at the moment.
How does it compare to other financial catastrophes like a stock market crash in terms of recovery? Can you make those comparisons?
Well, we actually went and trawled through the literature and looked at different things, different effects, different shocks that might cause an effect to the macroeconomy. So temperature increases or civil war, currency crises or financial crises. We actually find that for some, particularly the largest tropical cyclones, they're having effects that are as large as, say, a banking crisis or financial crisis, and actually showing an effect for a lot longer, so up to 20 years, as I said.
And that's, I guess, what we saw on slide 3 there. So we're going to put up another slide. The effect can accumulate. Tell us what we're seeing here.
Yes, so the way that we designed this research was to really look within a country and use it as a control for itself in the years where it didn't get hit. But of course, there's some countries that get hit over and over again. Thinking of the Philippines, just last year got hit by Typhoon Haiyan, but gets hit every year by multiple typhoons. So what actually happens is that one typhoon will hit, one hurricane, and the economy will start to slow down, growth will start to slow, and this becomes the new trend line for this economy. And then if another one hits during that period, it will be diverted again off that trend. So over years, if it gets hit sequentially, we could see quite a large divergence from their growth without tropical cyclones.
Does this whole set of trends argue against Keynesian economics in a certain sense? You know, the theory that if there is an economic downturn, the government should throw money at the problem to stimulate growth so there won't be deflation and deflation and deflation and depression? Or is it irrelevant to that? Because certainly governments are throwing money at recovery here, but you're saying that there isn't that much of an economic growth impact.
Well, the difference here between our situation and the Keynesian economic situation, that would be a recession, which is part of, really, if you think about the internal dynamics of an economy. Here, what we have is an external force coming in and destroying a lot of things. So in a typical recession, there's not going to be a large destruction of capital. So while there might be some parallels about spending, really we're looking at a different situation here where there's a lot of capital losses.
Let's put up your 5th slide and tell us what we're looking at here. Looks like one sort of bell curve and one pretty straight line going up and to the right. What's the contrast?
So this is two ways of displaying the same kind of data. So we initially got into this research wondering what the actual effect of disasters were on economic growth. And then as we saw that we had this large negative effect that accumulated, we decided to see whether or not we could pick out how much of the growth rate was accounted for by tropical cyclones. So in the graph with the bell curve, essentially what we do is we remove the effect of tropical cyclones and re-estimate our economic model. So one is the red curve is growth with the full model, and the blue curve is growth without tropical cyclones. And you could kind of see that it's a little bit more to the right, implying that growth was a little bit higher. Now on the panel on the right, you can see this even more so. In the blue line, which is the growth of world GDP without tropical cyclones, you can actually see that it grows about 1.2% faster than the world in which we're currently living.
So here's a list of economies that you released. Am I reading this right? Now, of course, it's very hard for the viewer to see the small print here and to relate to the numbers, but actually down at the bottom, it almost looks like the hurricanes in Australia and India contributed to economic growth, even though the ones in all these other countries, when you look at these individual events that had negative impacts in general, it almost looks like there's a plus factor in Australia and India. Is that what I'm seeing?
Well, so this is a slightly different question that we had. After realizing that some of the pattern of economic growth around the world could be explained by this environmental factor hitting countries, and knowing that the frequency and intensity of tropical cyclones is expected to change with climate change, we decided to see what, using the best models of changes to tropical cyclones for the next century, we decided to see what the extra cost on top of current damages would be due to climate change, changing the tropical cyclones. So this table is actually the additional costs relating from climate change, changing the intensity of tropical cyclones. And as you point out, completely correctly, in Australia and India, they're actually the biggest gainers. So in each different basin, ocean, where these things happen, so in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, they'll actually, some will increase and some will decrease. And what we're seeing from this is that climate change will probably lead, or so the best science at the moment says, to a decrease in intensity and in the Indian Ocean. So India and Bangladesh will actually suffer less damages with climate change. But while it seems like a rosy picture for them, overall around the world, this is quite a significant amount of losses associated with this increase in frequency and intensity with climate change.
So don't tell the government of India, or they'll come to the climate summit later this month and argue for doing nothing?
Well, perhaps, but there's a big cost benefit that goes into that there, and India is really suffering from a lot of other impacts. So this might offset some of the damages, but still a bleak picture for the largely agricultural sector of the Indian economy.
And so as the summit approaches, is the lesson for policymakers from your data simply do something because it matters, or is it more specific than that?
Well, we can have a lot of specific things to say, but I think one of the things which I would like people to take home from this paper is that the previously estimated costs of climate change by a professor called William Nordhaus were in the order of 17 trillion or so. Now, that wasn't including the effect that we see. And as you can see from this table, globally, we say that there's likely to be nearly a 10 trillion extra cost associated with tropical cyclones. So by doing this research, we've essentially added in an extra cost that nobody was really considering. So we have this idea almost that we know what's going to happen with climate change. We have some level of precision or understanding of what the costs are going to be. And so that's how we should make our policy, by doing that cost benefit calculation. But here we've just added an extra 50% cost on top of that. And it's really proof that we don't really know what the effects are going to be. And we should do something as quickly as possible, because there could be many other catastrophic effects or unknown effects which we just don't understand yet.
Fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's today's edition of Public Intellectual. I'm Brian Lehrer. And that's it for today's program. You'll find us here at this time each week. Next time, another in our series leading up to the UN Climate Conference and demonstrations set for September 21st. And tune into my daily radio show weekday mornings at 10 a.m. on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow, reaction to President Obama's address to the nation about ISIL and our use of military force. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.